Significance of the public sector labor relations. Developed from a time when public employees were required to lobby their respective legislators for favorable employment terms to one in which bona fide collective bargaining occurs. Public sector has become an increasingly important part of the collective bargaining environment in the U.S. Higher percentage of the public sector employees who are members of unions than there are private sector employees. Local governments had the highest union membership rate at 41.9%. Public sector union members is much greater in the Northeast, North, and West significance of the public sector relationships than in the South and Midwest. Significance of the public sector relationships. The American Federation of Government Employees is the largest union representing federal government employees. AFGE is legally required to represent 600,000 federal government employees and negotiates over 300 collective bargaining agreements. Federal government employees who are represented by the AFGE do not pay dues, but half the members pay dues to provide representational services, which is bargaining, grievance, handling, arbitration. Labor legislation in the public sector. General public's attitude influences the public sector's bargaining law. A major factor in encouraging public sector bargaining within a state is favorable legislation protecting employees' right to bargain, regulating unfair labor practices, and establishing procedures to resolve both interest and right-type labor disputes. Bargaining laws usually include wages, hours, and other terms and conditions for employment. Majority of states have some sort of statutory limitations on the scope of collective bargaining, which is limitations guaranteeing management rights. Unfair labor practices. Most states have legislations defining unfair labor practices for some or all public employers that are similar to the type of discrimination banned under the private sector, LMRA. And 13 states permit public sector strikes by some group of public employees, either by statutory law or judicial law, which is Alaska, California, Colorado, Hawaii, Idaho, Illinois, Louisiana, Minnesota, Montana, Ohio, Oregon, Pennsylvania, and Vermont. The state Supreme Court ruled that strikes by public employees in California were legal if they did not represent substantial or imminent threat to the public's health or safety. Most states prohibit employee strikes and may authorize a variety of potential sanctions for illegal strike activity: jail sentences, fines, loss of union recognition. Certain employees such as police officers, firefighters, hospital employees, and correctional officers are usually prohibited from striking under any circumstance. Services of these employees are deemed to be critical to citizens' health and safety. Police officers, firefighters, and teachers are most likely to be offered an alternative dispute resolution procedure to the strike, which would be mediation, fact-finding, or interest arbitration. Most federal employees' bargaining rights are governed by the Title VII of the CSRA. U.S. Postal Service employees are the only public employee covered by the Private Sector Labor Management Relations Act, have no legal right to strike but are granted access to the final binding interest arbitration as it means resolving bargaining disputes. Current challenges to collective bargaining rights of public unions. Retiree health benefits are rising by 20% a year thanks to budget deficits and higher pension and healthcare costs. The shortfalls for pension obligations are estimated to be as high as $1 trillion thanks to the stock market plunge between 2007 and 2009. Recent Pew Center on the States indicated that the shortage of $1 trillion on the 3.35 obligation in pension, healthcare, and other retirement benefit states have promised current and retired employees. Politicians blame public sector unions and bargaining rights as a cause of state budget deficits. However, researchers have found there is no correlation. With the state of Wisconsin facing a $100 million shortage, Governor Walker proposed that in the Wisconsin legislation passed, collective bargaining for most states and local government employees, firefighters and state patrol employees were not included, is limited to wages only, health coverages, vacation, and other benefits will not be negotiable. State government employees will contribute 5.8% of their pay to pensions. State government employees will pay at least 12.6% to healthcare premium. Most pay 6% now. The state will stop collecting union dues for employee paychecks. Public sector union members would have the right to not pay dues. There would be a secret ballot election annually for every public sector union to determine whether most of the total number of workers still wanted the union. New collective bargaining agreements will be negotiated every year. Pay raises will be limited to the Consumer Price Index unless the public approved a greater raise in a voter referendum. Federal sector labor relations legislation. Patronage systems. spoils system was when a U.S. president can appoint people to virtually any office based on their loyalty. Criticized because the people appointed weren't necessarily qualified. Civil service system required that new hires meet minimum qualifications for most federal jobs. Also create a set of human resources policies designed to ensure that workers are treated fairly and protected from unfair dismissal. CSRA regulates labor relations for federal employees. CSRA established the Federal Labor Relations Authority, an independent, neutral agency that administers the Federal Labor Relations Program and investigates unfair labor practices. FLRA oversees the creation of bargaining units, supervises representation elections, conducts hearings and resolves complaints of unfair labor practices, hears appeals regarding arbitration awards, and assists federal agencies in dealing with labor relations issues. Run by chairman, 2 members appointed by bipartisan for 5-year terms. Federal Service Impasse Panel provides assistance in resolving negotiation impasses. Role is to resolve bargaining impasses between federal agencies and unions and federal government that arise over negotiating terms and conditions of employment. Composed of a chairman and at least 6 members who are knowledgeable about labor relations management, familiar with federal government operations, and appointed by the president for 5-year terms. The Merit System Protection Board is an independent quasi-judicial agency created by CSRA to hear appeals from federal employees who allege violations of their employment rights. Appropriate bargaining units and union recognition in the federal sector, established on an agency, plant, installation, function, or other basis to ensure a clear and identifiable community of interest among employees and to promote effective federal agency operations. Criteria used for determining the extent to which employees in different federal jobs share a sufficient community of interest are similar to those used by National Labor Relations Board in the private sector, comparing jobs to identify common duties and skills, similar working conditions, common supervision, degree of work interdependence, and physical proximity of the job. Negotiable subjects in the federal sector. In federal sector, the agency and exclusivity recognized union have a duty to meet at a reasonable time to confer a good faith with respect to mandatory subjects of collective bargaining, such as certain personnel policies and practices and working conditions, to the extent appropriate laws and regulations allow such negotiations. One party can legally refuse to negotiate issues. Subjects prohibited from negotiations are to determine the mission, budgets, organization, number of employees, and internal security practices, to hire, assign, direct, lay off, and retain employees in accordance to applicable law, to suspend, remove, reducing grade or pay, or take any disciplinary action, to assign work, subcontract, or select employees for promotion for properly ranked and certified candidates and other apprentice sources, to take whatever actions may be necessary to carry out agency's mission during emergencies, and wages. Unfair labor practices in the federal sector. CSRA specified unfair labor practices to protect the rights of individual employees, labor organizations, and federal agencies, restraining and coercing employees in the exercise of their rights, encouraging and discouraging union membership, sponsoring, controlling, or assisting a labor organization, discipline union members who file complaints, and refusing to recognize or negotiate with the designated labor organization. Remedies include issuance of a cease and desist order and or appropriate make-whole type of remedies, such as requiring that an employee be reinstated with back pay. CSRA makes it an unfair labor practice to refuse or fail to cooperate with in-place procedures and decisions. Grievance procedures and arbitration in the federal sector. Grievance is defined as any complaint by an employer, labor organization, or agency relating to employment with the agency and any claim violation, misinterpretation, or misapplication of any law, rule, or regulation affecting conditions of employment. CSRA requires all negotiated agreements in the federal sector include a grievance procedure with binding arbitration as its final step. All matters within the allowable limits of the CSRA are within the scope of grievance procedures negotiated by the parties unless the parties have specifically agreed to exclude certain matters from coverage. Negotiated grievance procedures serve as the exclusive forum for bargaining unit employees in most cases. Labor management forums in the federal government. On December 29, 2009, President Obama issued Executive Order 13-522, creating labor management forums to improve delivery of government services. This order mandated the creation of forums throughout the federal service to involve unions in decision-making to improve productivity and save money. The Homeland Security Act, enacted in 2002, transferred several existing agencies to the Department of Homeland Security, operated under the Board and Transportation Security, Emergency Preparedness Response, Chemical, Biological, Radiological, and Nuclear Countermeasures, and Information Analysis and Infrastructure Protection. Under the HSA, the President may waive employee union rights under the CSRA if such application would have a substantial adverse impact on the ability of the Department to protect Homeland Security and/or agency subdivisions or unions. Missions and responsibilities are materially changed, and most of the affected employees are assigned intelligence, counterintelligence. It's investigative work directly related to terrorism investigations, their primary duty. National security personnel systems includes changes to personnel matters as pay for performance, performance appraisals, training, promotion, pay, classifications, labor relations, and employee appeals. Transportation security officers chose who would represent them when it came to the American Federation of Government Employees and the National Treasury Union. With 85% of 44,000 voted in favor of the American Federation of Government Employees, this election was the labor movement's most important victories. The Postal Reorganization Act fulfilled the desires of the postal unions to have their labor management relations program established by statute. Post Office Department never fully accepted collective bargaining, even though it was the largest employer in the U.S. and had the largest proportion of employees belonging to unions. PRA created the U.S. Postal Service as an independent entity within the executive branch of the federal government. Similarities between private and public sector bargaining. Many participants in public sector bargaining are trained and gain experience in the private sector. Labor relation practitioners in the public sector tend to rely on private sector approach. Public and private employees form and join unions when they are not satisfied with one or more terms or conditions of employment. Parties are trying to increase their bargaining power relative to the other parties by increasing the other party's cost of disagreeing with the party's position, or by reducing the other party's cost of agreeing with the party's position. The market economy does not operate in the public sector. Public services such as public education, welfare services, and police and fire protection are provided to citizens at little or no additional cost. Lack of substituted services eliminates one of the management strike costs, loss of business to a competitor, and many public services are provided regardless of customer use.
Public employers have experienced increased pressure to emulate changes in labor relation practices occurring in the private sector by privatizing some public services, broadening job classifications and multi-skilled job descriptions, using more part-time or contingent employees, paying for performance, adopting flexible and alternative work schedules, reducing supervision and encouraging employee involvement and empowerment, decentralizing and streamlining bureaucratic operating structures and methods, and increasing labor management cooperation. The specific influence of the budget on the public sector bargaining process remains uncertain, but union negotiators' main concerns pertain to securing benefits for their members. It's up to management to find sufficient funds for equitably negotiated settlement.
Another way that public employment differs from private employment is that public employees have some legal rights and obligations that private employees do not. Because citizens pay the taxes that pay public employee salaries, employers have to be careful of the image employees project. Although freedom of speech and association are constitutional rights, there are limits to their exercise by public employees. The Supreme Court has identified several reasons for which these rights may be limited, including the need to maintain discipline and harmony in the workplace, the need for confidentiality, and the need to ensure that proper performance of duties is not impeded. Merit systems protect employees from political influence and corruption in hiring, pay, job classification, as well as discipline and discharge. Public sector supervisors may be prohibited from joining unions in some jurisdictions. They may be in the same bargaining units as other employees in other jurisdictions, or they can join unions in separate bargaining units. One of the differences between public and private sector labor relations is unionization of supervisors and other managers. There have been questions about the loyalty, identity, and organizational commitment of public sector supervisory unions, and the logic for exclusion is rooted in the need of the employer to have the undivided loyalty of supervisors and other managerial employees. However, research has identified little negative effect from unionization of supervisors. It has been determined that supervisors can wear two hats. They are loyal to the mission of the agency and act as supervisors to further the mission of the agency while they are also union members. Exemption by statute of many traditional collective bargaining subjects limits the ability of both unions and managers to resolve some disputes through the bargaining process. Most compensation issues affecting federal budgets are excluded from the scope of mandatory bargaining subjects. Multilateral bargaining is a term used to describe the involvement of multiple parties in the collective bargaining process. End-run bargaining involves a union making a direct appeal to a legislative body or government official who has the final decision-making authority, rather than dealing exclusively with the designated management negotiator present at the bargaining table. Sunshine laws refer to efforts to open up the bargaining process to citizen observation and participation. The rationale for this approach is that citizens can provide more input into how tax dollars are spent by their involvement, and openness reduces public distrust of the bargaining process. Negotiators often seek to avoid bargaining in the sunshine because it becomes more difficult to make necessary trade-offs amongst bargaining priorities and terms. The public sector has widely accepted the grievance procedure with binding arbitration as the mechanism for resolving conflicts over the interpretation and application of the collective bargaining agreement. Once a grievance is appealed to arbitration, the parties make a significant effort to resolve the grievances before the formal arbitration hearing. Although grievance arbitration initially was intended to avoid legalism, the process of arbitration appears to be evolving as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. The types of grievance subjects arbitrated in the public sector do not vary significantly from the private sector experience, and in both sectors, discipline and discharge cases constitute the largest single category of grievance disputes. The right to strike, considered by many a vital instrument for successful collective bargaining, is usually prohibited by statute in the public sector. The basic argument given for legislative prohibition of strikes is that services provided by public organizations are essential to the general welfare of the citizens. Work stoppages and refusals to work would adversely affect the delivery of such vital services and create disorder in the community. Some would prohibit public sector strikes because they would place too much power in the hands of a union relative to taxpayers. Unions would unnecessarily benefit at the expense of other groups that are dependent on government revenues but do not have a right to strike or participate in power ploys with public officials. Private sector employees may be disciplined or discharged for off-duty misconduct. Employers in the public sector have a heightened sensitivity about off-duty misconduct of their employees. In both the private and public sectors, the employees retain the right to conduct their private lives as they see fit. In the private sector, the employer may discipline the employee, but will be required to prove that the off-duty conduct had harmed productivity, adversely affected the business, and or other employees refused to work with the convicted criminal. Legislation usually prohibits public employees from striking, but requires participation in impasse resolution procedures before striking. These procedures play an important role in resolving interest disputes. These procedures normally involve a third-party neutral who assists the parties in reaching an agreement without interrupting services or endangering the public interest. Legislation for public sector impasse resolution procedures vary from state to state, but may combine mediation, fact-finding, and conventional arbitration. Mediation involves a third-party neutral who has no binding authority to decide a dispute, but assists the parties' efforts to reach a voluntary agreement. Mediation is the least intrusive and is little more than an adjunct to the negotiation process. The mediation process is relatively informal and unstructured. Lastly, mediation tends to be more successful when the parties are unsure of themselves or have a personality conflict. Fact-finding involves a third-party neutral who conducts a hearing to assess unions and management's collective bargaining positions on issues in dispute. A fact finder must interpret data and other information presented and recommend settlement positions to the parties and, in some jurisdictions, to the legislators. Fact finding provides deadlines for the parties to resolve their differences, provides fresh, knowledgeable perspectives, and gives negotiators political coverage because negotiators can blame the neutral for the eventual settlement. Arbitration is very similar to fact-finding in they provide deadlines, they provide fresh perspectives, and give negotiators political coverage. But unlike fact-finding or mediation, arbitration entails a binding decision by a third-party neutral who settles the negotiation impasse. Arbitration is set up this way so that if the party knows the arbitrator will be selecting the most reasonable position of the parties' positions will converge. These techniques can also carry some disadvantages. The fact finder's recommendation and arbitration decision may lead to a settlement in terms, but may not resolve the genuine differences between the union and management. In some cases, the parties might cement their respective positions in hopes of getting a better deal from the arbitrator or more favorable recommendation from the fact finder. This is known as the chilling effect. One final impasse resolution procedure that is sometimes used to resolve public sector interest disputes is to submit unresolved issues to the taxpayer referendum or vote.